I'm Craig Whitlock, and I graduated in 1990, and I'm a reporter at the Washington Post, and I was editor of the Chronicle in 89 through 90. Well, it was great. It was life transforming. I had more fun at the Chronicle and learned more in 1 year as editor than any other job I've had since. So very, very memorable. We had tons of news and lifelong friendships. And, I just learned a tremendous amount about journalism and working in a newsroom. That's where it all started, and I learned my life lessons there. One of the most memorable stories during my year as editor from 1989 to 1990 was shortly after the start of the fall semester. A reporter, an editor on our staff named Keith Lublin, who was our features editor, got a tip. Keith had heard from just some friends of his that there was this person who was a student, or at least they thought was a student, who was posing as a member of the Rothschild banking family from Europe, but he's an imposter. He's not who he says he is. So Keith started reporting on it, and pretty quickly we did a story that this guy, Maurice de Rothschild, was in fact under investigation by Duke. At that time they called it Duke Public Safety instead of Duke Police, and the FBI for masquerading as somebody he wasn't. And of course, this is like the gods of journalism dropping a story like this in your lap as you start your senior year as editor is just, you couldn't ask for anything better. And for the rest of the semester, the Chronicle proceeded to step by step unmask who this imposter was. And the nuts and bolts of the story, I think maybe will echo through the years with people who've gone to Duke, was that this imposter had really ingratiated himself with people at high levels of the university because they thought he was filthy rich. And they thought he and his family would give a bundle of money to the university. So they gave him all sorts of privileges. And it turned out he was penniless and he was a fraud. So Maurice de Rothschild, instead of being an heir to the French banking fortune, was in fact 37 years old. And he was born in El Paso, and his family were Mexican immigrants. And so he had just completely made this up, but made people think he was a member of the de Rothschild family. And the university completely fell for it, right? He had been in the Army, he had gone to a few schools here and there in the 70s, but he had no academic background. And he just talked his way in to getting into Duke. But he was cosseted by the highest levels of the university because clearly they thought this was a guy with a lot of money. There was a reporter named Chris O'Brien, who was one of our news editors, and he actually got this guy's Social Security number and called the Social Security office in Washington. And back in those days, people would tell you stuff they don't now, and figure out through his Social Security number what his original identity was. And then we tracked it down to his birth records in El Paso. And finally, Chris got his father on the phone a couple months later, where he tells this crazy story about he was estranged from his son, but the guy had always sort of fantasized about being someone rich and famous and would tell people things, and he passed himself off as a de Rothschild eventually. But the university had egg on its face the entire way because it was clear they had been doing favors for this guy. And he was under investigation not just for passing himself off as somebody he wasn't, but ironically for being someone from the de Rothschild family. He was always hitting people up for money, right? Including he had gotten some loans and lines of credit from the Duke University Credit Union. And Chris O'Brien went to the courthouse and found out that Maurice was being sued by the credit union because he hadn't paid back several $1,000s in loans. And he gets the credit union's lawyer on the phone who says, "Oh yeah, that guy," and he goes, "Somebody at Duke told the credit union to give him a big loan," right? Like they were twisting people's arms, and it's an outrage, and it was the people at the top of the university were saying, "Give this guy special treatment." So we kind of went from there, and we sent Chris to Fort Lauderdale to chase after this guy's history. And finally, by the end of the semester, we had reconstructed this guy's life over the previous 20 years. Of course, the question is, how could the university fall for this? He had no academic record, wasn't his real name, he didn't have the money. All it took was to figure out who his family was. Why didn't you do a background check? One of the funniest aspects of this was that when he was detected at the beginning of the fall semester, the guy clearly knew the jig was up and he was trying to get out of the university. And so he had applied to transfer to Harvard, right? So Chris O'Brien calls up Harvard University, the admissions office. And again, back in these days, I don't know why it's so different now, but back then people would talk to you. You could get them on the phone. So Chris talks to the assistant dean of admissions, who says, oh yeah, that guy, yeah, he was in here saying that he was going to transfer here, and we kicked him out immediately because it was so obvious he was crazy or that he was a fraud, and he wasn't who he said he was. You could tell immediately this guy wasn't 22 years old. So it was a very embarrassing moment for Duke University. They really did fall for this, and the only reason they let this guy in as a student was because they thought they could get money out of him. And the joke was on them, but this story really transfixed, it captivated the entire campus for months on end. And all along the guy was missing, right? He just flew the coop, and the Duke Public Safety and the FBI couldn't find him. And finally he was arrested several months later. He was indicted on fraud charges and he served some time in jail. But it was just one of those classic stories that you can't possibly make up, and was very memorable. But I was very proud that it was the Chronicle who figured out the full story. The university said they didn't know who this guy was. We were the ones who figured it out, the reporters on staff. We were the ones who tracked down his history, who figured out he had tried to get into Harvard. The university was just embarrassed and kind of went into a shell. They didn't know what to say. They, in fact, were hoping it would go away. But this is the role of student journalists, is to tell the news, dig when it's an investigative story. And I felt like we had a real connection with the campus that year, because they were all just, everybody on campus, students, staff, you name it, were dying to read the next Maurice story, right? And figure out what we found out. So it was a special year, and that was by far the most entertaining story. Yeah, so of course, you spend all this time up there, right? And you do it because you love it. You love journalism, you love the news, you love camaraderie. And these are people from all over campus who you wouldn't necessarily have met otherwise. These weren't necessarily people in your dorm or your living group or from where you were from. And it's just by this pure love for journalism and informing the campus. And so that's great. These are all people brought together by common interest. And in recent years, I've covered the US military a lot for the Washington Post. So the best analogy I can come up with is it's kind of like your war buddies, right? These are people you're in the trenches with under a lot of pressure, every day, deadline pressure. Things are completely unexpected in terms of news and what you have to cover, and crises on campus, and you're in the middle of all this, and these are your compadres, right? These are the people you're in the midst of it with, and so you do form that, I think, very special bond. And I'm sure that's something that resonates with anyone who's worked at the Chronicle over the years. And because it is it's an entirely student-run newsroom, and certainly was back then, you don't have faculty members there, journalism school people telling you what to do, and you're on your own. And that was such a liberating feeling, a feeling of responsibility, but a hell of a lot of fun too. And so these are people that you get to know everything about, but you're all on the same team, and you never get a bond like that again, I guess. The biggest takeaways as a journalist is you really learn the fundamentals of reporting and editing and journalism. I mean, this was a pure education in that sense. You learned from other students. Back then there were no journalism classes at Duke, or maybe there was one or two available through public policy studies, where they would have a professional journalist come in and teach a class on But even then it was more like media in Washington or things like that. They weren't news writing classes or things like of that sort. So you learned everything from other students at the Chronicle, and they had learned it from people from the upperclassmen before them. And so this was passed along, and remarkably the culture and the fundamentals were quite good. That, you know, accuracy was foremost. When I still remember quite clearly coming up as a first year person, and there was a sign on the managing editor's desk that said, "This is no place to be nice. This is a newsroom." And then the name under it was Rocky, right? And I was, you know, that was a little intimidating to me. It was like, wow, this is a serious place. And Rocky at the time, Rocky Rosen, was a managing editor, and he was a very serious journalist. But I only found out later that people were kind of poking fun at him a little bit for maybe being over serious. And Rocky wasn't this big imposing figure. He was actually this, you know, very thin guy, but very serious journalist. So people were trying to take the piss out of him a little bit, so to speak. But that was the message was clear that it was a serious place. You didn't just go there to goof off, that you had to get your facts right. You had to be fair. You know, everything had to be absolutely fair. And how do you write a story? How do you edit it? How do you meet deadline? All these basics of journalism, that's where I learned them, and it was the best place to learn all that stuff. I think without question, what I learned at the Chronicle was accountability reporting and not backing down in the face of pressure. So we were the daily source of news for all of Duke University. And that was a lot of fun, but it came with a lot of responsibility. Get your facts straight and be accurate. But, you know, as has happened over the years, sometimes there's pressure to change your coverage or to tone it down or to not cover something. And when I was there, the Chronicle was always very good about not backing down in front of anyone. And the biggest emblem of that was in the spring semester of my senior year, Mike Krzyzewski wasn't too happy with our sports staff's coverage of the men's basketball team. And his staff called up our editors, the sports editors, and said, "The coach wants to come speak with you. You know, we want you to come later this week and meet the coach." And they kind of presented it as a get to know you better meeting, like something very casual. So our whole sports staff went over to Cameron. They actually had it in the locker room, and they walk in, and there's Coach K, but there's the whole team too, sitting down, and they weren't looking very happy. And our sports editors, Rodney Peel and Brent Belvin, and the rest of them came back that night. Their faces looked pretty shocked. I was like, "Oh, how'd your meeting with Coach K go?" And they go, "You won't believe it. You won't believe what happened, Bruiser." That was my nickname back then, was Bruiser. And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" Like, I couldn't figure out what they were. And they said, "He screamed at us, he screamed at us." And I was like, "Okay, slow down, what happened?" Well, it turned out that Coach K was very unhappy with the Chronicle's coverage, and he chewed out the entire sports staff in front of the whole team and wouldn't let them get a word in edgewise. And when I say chewed out, he chewed them out like only Coach K does, right? You know, it was a very foul-mouthed, obscenity-laced, he reamed them out. Like, you know, he thought they were part of the team and they weren't being as positive as he thought they should be, and he let them have it and wouldn't let them say anything. So these guys come back and they're like, "What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do?" I'm like, "Well, you know, we're gonna write a story about it. If this is news, if the coach went off against other journalists like that, you know, we would write a story about it. So we're gonna write a story about this too." Now, we were fortunate in the sense that one of our sports reporters, a guy named Andy Layton, Andy's from New York and he's kind of street smart, right? And he kind of picked up a vibe that maybe this wasn't gonna be a get to know you session, that maybe it was something else. So he had brought a tape recorder and he had it in he had like a gym bag with him, and he pressed record as soon as they went in, right? Because sports reporters are always recording everything. And he recorded the whole rant from Coach K. So this was, from a reporting standpoint, this is priceless, right? You know, we've got a recording of it. He can't come back and deny he said what he did. And nobody ever said anything about this being off the record or anything. The sports staff went in the locker room, Coach K starts screaming at them. So from our perspective, this is all on the record. There were probably 24 people in the room. So, he can't legitimately claim he thought it was a private meeting. This was open in front of a bunch of journalists, and Andy happened to get it on tape. So we didn't publish that night because it was kind of late. So we had one of our news editors, Chris Graham, come in, who barely went to basketball games probably, right? But we wanted somebody who could be impartial and independent. And he starts reporting, and he calls up, of course, the basketball office, see if he can get comment from Coach K, radio silence. He calls up the athletic director at the time, a guy named Tom Butters, and says, I want to, doing a story about Coach K being unhappy with our coverage. I want to get comment from the athletic director, right? Very straightforward. So Butters calls him back and essentially threatens him and says, if the Chronicle wants to make an issue of this, somebody's going to come out a loser. And so, not a very veiled threat. So we're like, what do you mean by that? No comment, so that goes right up high in the story, right? We've got it all right there. And this is shocking when the story comes out, because back then, of course, Coach K was, as he was throughout his career, he was the most famous person at Duke University. He was also the golden goose in those years, right? That the university didn't want to do anything to alienate this young, successful basketball coach. They had been to 4 Final Fours in 5 years, and so there's radio silence from the Duke administration. They don't want to say anything that pisses off the coach. They don't want to come to the defense of the student journalists. So we were on our own, and we printed this story. We didn't, we had the tape of what he said, and we played it straight down the middle as much as we could, even though we were part of the story. And it probably won't shock people that most people at Duke and around the country took the coach's side, right? Like, how dare these student journalists piss off the coach? And how dare they write anything critical of the team? So we knew that wasn't our job. We're not there to be fans. We're not part of the team. We're journalists. And yes, we're students, but we're journalists just the same. So we're going to cover this like any other professional journalist would. And yeah, we came under a lot of pressure. To this day, I vividly remember, getting direct calls from faculty members, board of trustees members, university administrators. They were not happy with us, right? They were really, really not. We did not get one word of support from people in the university administration. They didn't do anything to threaten us beyond what the athletic director said, but it was a lonely feeling. But at the same time, you're with your group of fellow journalists, and you're in the trenches together, and we knew we were in the right. We knew we were handling this properly. We hadn't done anything wrong, and it's our job to report the news. And of course, that can't help but make a big impression on you, particularly when you go into journalism for your career. And so that's something I'll always remember, the importance of standing up to tell the truth, no matter what kind of pressure you come under. And if you're 22 and you can report that at Duke University when you get into a big fight with a basketball coach, that takes some backbone on the part of our staff. But I'm proud to say we had that backbone, and I always look back on that and I feel nothing but pride about the way we handled it. So I think this is probably something that every editor of the Chronicle has struggled with, is how much time do you spend in the newsroom, and how much time do you spend on your studies and going to class? And I was fine as a student. Part of me wishes I'd spent more time on the academic side of things, right? That I made it through fine, and I was a history major and really enjoyed it. But you do sacrifice, right, the time you're able to spend on academic work and research. And I didn't get to study abroad. I devoted my campus life in large part to the Chronicle, and I don't regret that for a minute. But I do regret a little bit that I wasn't able to make full exploitation of academic life at Duke. Now, again, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Journalism ended up being my career. It wasn't planned that way. And I think to use a cliche, I think I found my calling at the Chronicle. And luckily I was able to make a job out of it, make a career out of it. But I learned more doing that than I would have learned in the classroom studying other academic issues. So I don't regret that choice. But sometimes you wish you could have both, and you can't always do that. I had no idea, right? I was a history major. I had sort of vaguely in my mind it'd be fun to be a historian and to maybe go into academia, but it seemed so narrow to me that you have to focus on such a specific specialty. And I love journalism because you get to stick your nose in everything, right? You become a generalist in anything that comes, any subject, and things you don't expect. And that was one of the things I loved with journalism is you don't know what to expect on any given day. And journalism gives you a license to get in everybody's business, and you learn so much that way. So one of the ironies of this is, as a history major, not going into history, was as a journalist, I later, at the Washington Post, one series we wrote was called the Afghanistan Papers in 2019, which was an expose of the war in Afghanistan and how leaders in the US government and the Pentagon and the White House had lied to the public about what was going on in the war for 20 years. And I ended up writing a book about it called the Afghanistan Papers. So the irony is I did write a history book, right? And that was one of the highlights of my career, but it was as a journalist. And if I hadn't learned how to be a journalist at the Chronicle, that would have never happened. But in a way, I got to have my cake and eat it too. I just really hope that the Chronicle can stay as a very solid, independent news organization. There's been a lot of business challenges, financial challenges with journalism across the board in our country the last 20 years, but particularly for student newsrooms. That one of the great things about the Chronicle is that it's an independent news organization. It's not part of the university. But financially, that's hard to do nowadays. When I was there, it was much easier. That it had only been several years before I came to Duke, the Chronicle had been financed in large part by student fees, and there was a decision made to become independent and finance the Chronicle solely through advertising. In those days, you could, because it was the only source of information on campus, and all of the revenue came from ads. And the papers were really thick. They made a lot of money that way, so it worked in that business model for a time. But as you well know, that eventually changed, unfortunately. So it becomes much harder to remain independent financially. And I just hope the Chronicle is able to maintain that, because having that independence is so important in so many ways to learn the lessons that I did and so many others have been able to learn in terms of getting the story right and sticking to the news under pressure. But I'll give you an interesting twist on that. When I was editor, the president of Duke was a guy named Keith Brody. When the Coach K fight happened, I remember later, a couple of months later, having a chat with Dr. Brody before I graduated, and he said, "Thank God the Chronicle is an independent student organization." I said, "Well, I agree, but why are you saying that, right?" And he says, "Because every time I get a call about some crap that you wrote, I could tell them, look, we don't have anything to do with them. They're an independent organization. They're not part of the university that way. I have no control over them." And so he said, particularly with the Coach K news, he said, I got a lot of pressure from the Board of Trustees, from donors, say, "Can't you do something about this?" And his response was, no, the Chronicle's an independent student news organization. Yes, they cover the university, but no, we don't control them. If you want to talk to them, here's their number, right? And I respected and appreciated that, but it also, some of it was principle on his part, but I really think it was pragmatic, right? He liked being able to say, I can't control what they do. That made it good for the university. At least he recognized that that independence didn't just serve the Chronicle, but serve the university writ large. And so I really hope that can always stay the case. So Matt was like a lot of people who came to Duke who wandered up to Third Floor Flowers as a first-year student and during one of the open houses and got hooked on campus journalism, right? And so he, like many others, ended up spending more and more time up there every day. Matt was from New York. He was really smart. I think he was a political science major, but I may have that wrong. He loved journalism. He was insatiable in his curiosity, and he was just one of those people who couldn't make themselves leave, right? So he was a year younger than me. He was a managing editor my senior year. So he ran the Chronicle with me to a large degree. And he was one of those people who really gave his, I hate to say it, but he gave his life to the Chronicle. He devoted his life. Like others, he was a smart kid. He did well in school, but that's what he did. And he had been elected to be editor his senior year. And unfortunately, he came down with leukemia. And his health wasn't good. He wasn't sure what it was. And it took some while to get tested. And it was a traumatic time for everybody at the Chronicle because he was such a beloved guy. He was always had a smile on his face. He's always cracking jokes, but he was a serious, serious journalist. And it was such a shame because he was made to be editor of the Chronicle and he couldn't really serve out his term because he was getting treatment at Duke Hospital. So he was really a very vivid presence on campus, particularly at the Chronicle, but with the university at large. Not because his family had money and power or anything like that, but just this was a kid who was going places. He had an internship offer at what was back then called the St. Petersburg Times. You knew he was going to go on to a really long and successful career in journalism, and it was cut short. And there's no other way to describe it than as a tragedy, because he had so much potential and promise, and he was such a good, pure guy that it was hard for everybody. I think it took the Chronicle a couple years just to recover from that. So I think his parents, his family wanted, they knew how much the Chronicle meant to him, and they wanted to establish some kind of memorial at Duke. Not only did we have this, his funeral was in New York City, but there was a memorial at the chapel that was packed, right? And his parents, they, like a lot of parents, maybe they don't come down that much to see their kids, but they know they're spending all their time at the Chronicle, right? That was his home. And so I think they wanted a way to memorialize him, and I think that was an effective way, right? That Matt is like so many people who've worked at the Chronicle. He did it for the right reasons. He did it for joy. He did it as a sense of public service. He just soaked everything up like a sponge. And I think his parents wanted to remember that, but also, give a model for other folks. And I'm sure that's what's happened over the years, but I'm really glad they did that, because if there's one person who I worked with who deserves to be remembered like that, it's Matt Sclafani. Matt was a really smart journalist and he worked his butt off, but Matt was a hell of a lot of fun, right? He was a good guy, and in a wholesome way. He loved to joke. He just saw the joy in journalism and the joy in what we did and the joy in telling the campus community what was going on. That was our job, but it wasn't work. It was joy. It was a fun. And everybody goes to Duke University as an undergraduate. I wish they could find a career like that, some meaning in life in what you do. And with Matt, he had that and was a shining example of that he had found it, right? Even though his life was cut short, he found that meaning in what he was doing, that joy, that fun, and meaningful nature of journalism. And so I hope that's what he's remembered for. You know, the guy loved what he did. He was never in a bad mood. He always just was so wound up about whatever the story of the day was. He took such pleasure in it. And, you know, journalism's a fun racket, right? You know, people do it because they enjoy it, because there's meaning in it and purpose in it, but it should be fun. And to Matt, it was fun in only the best ways.